Good afternoon. It's 2:45 exactly. We're going to begin this session with Jennie Milne. I'm the self-imposed introducer. My name is Karen Franklin, and I'm here because I played a very small part in the journey that Jennie has taken. Very quickly, a sketch of Jennie's background. She discovered that she was Jewish 4 years ago. She lives in Scotland. She has 9 children. This is the story of her mother. It's her mother's story, 3 generations of women. Her success has been made by the fact that she used together DNA, records, and oral history. But what's really compelling about Jennie's story is her tenacity, her quest for her roots, her quests for her identity, her work in genealogy that was not a means towards an end of genealogy, but the means by which she understood who she is and what motivated her family to become who they were. She's successful because she has engaged so many supportive mentors and friends on her way. And she's mostly successful that I know of because she has more friends on Facebook than I do. But actually, that's not all that hard. So, Jennie.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. I can't tell you what an honor it is to be here in Warsaw. I never believed 4 years ago when I met Michael Tobias, we sat and had a coffee in Glasgow, that this is where I would be 4 years later. So I'm here to tell you my family story, really. How I managed to trace my grandparents from very, very little information. I called it Fragments That Remain because it was just fragments of information. So I'm sure for all of you, genealogy begins with something personal. And for me, it was a relationship. For me, when I think of genealogy, I think of history and heritage, and I think of roots and relationship. And it started with me with this relationship with my mom. It was a difficult relationship, and I found it really hard to connect throughout her life because Mom never felt that she belonged anywhere. She didn't know who she was. She'd been abandoned as a baby in 1943. Her mother was in the Polish army, and she couldn't look after her baby, so she left her. This is me when I'm 18 months old on the left, and I'm always looking back. My mum used to say to me, Jennie, don't look back, look forward. And I'm not a person that lives in the past necessarily, but I understand that the past gives us the context that we need for our lives. And so even at 18 months old, I'm holding my mum's hand, but I'm looking back. What can I see? Now, Simone Weil said in her essay that she wrote after the Second World War, The Need for Roots, to be rooted is perhaps the most important and least recognized need of the human soul. And this is one of the earliest pictures I have of Mum as a little girl. She's got a trowel, a garden trowel, I don't know what you call it in another language, like she's away to plant something. But my mum herself was never planted. She never had those roots, and it affected her children and subsequent generations. What did she know? She knew that her father was Stanisław Lis, and her mother was named Helena, or maybe her mother was named Helena, she wasn't sure. She actually met both her parents in the 1960s, very briefly. Her father was involved in the Polish government in exile, she knew that. She met her mother once in a cafe in London, and she told her a little bit about herself, but quickly my mum lost touch. Now, to tell you a little bit about this city and what it means to be here, my grandparents married in Warsaw in 1933. My grandfather, Stanisław, was a member of the Polish government. He was in the treasury. He was a military man. He'd fought for the independence of Poland when he was 17, and he was awarded the Cross of Valor, twice nominated for the Virtuti Militari, Poland's highest military award. And one of my helper translators found a line in his records saying that he was in charge of the foreign delegation at the funeral of Marshal Józef Pilsudski. So when I went to look for a slide to go with this, and I realized the scale of that funeral, I realized how well integrated they were into Warsaw society. I couldn't believe the number of people. It was a state funeral. So my granddad moved in those circles. Now, according to his records, he was called up by telephone at 5 in the morning on the 24th of August, 1939, to fight. He was in charge of 1st DAC's ammunition column, and he marshaled his men, he got the battalion together, and they made out for Warsaw. He said that he arrived in Warsaw on the 30th of August, and that, in his words, is where the war met him. He fought with his men really bravely, all of them, until Warsaw capitulated, and he was captured by the Germans. So he remained a prisoner of war of the Germans for 4 days, but my granddad, you couldn't keep him down. I like to think I've inherited some of his genes. He escaped, and he left Poland for the last time on the 18th of December, 1939. He made his way to France, where he fought again, until France capitulated. He escaped to Switzerland. He was interred in Switzerland, but after 11 months, he'd had enough. He escaped again, and he made his way to Britain, arriving in Liverpool in 1941 in October. He was disciplined, actually, by the Polish army for escaping from Switzerland, but they realized he was a good officer, and so they sent him to Scotland, where he trained troops for the remainder of the war. My grandmother, we believe, escaped with the Polish government through Romania, possibly. So what did my mum know? She knew she'd been left, aged 2 weeks old, at a baby's home, a wartime baby's home, 200 miles from where she was born, in a village called Hope Cove in Devon. This lady, Rose Toms, took the little girl from her mum. She said she showed up on the doorstep, and she asked her if she could look after this baby until the war was over, because she had to fight in the Polish army. So when the war finished, my mum was left behind. She said, like a lost luggage parcel. All the other children were picked up, but there was nobody to pick up my mum. So this nurse, who was an orphan herself, she had no family, she raised my mum as her own daughter. Now, Mum knew that her birth certificate had been falsified, and it was really challenging, actually, finding her mother, because she never used a correct name. And you can see here on the birth certificate, she's called herself Ellen Lease, formerly Kolomarecki. And when I first wanted to search in 1999, I discovered that Kolomarecki isn't a name, even. Now, my mum had a good childhood. Rose sacrificed everything she had so that she could bring up this little girl well. And although they'd left Devon, the baby's home closed down and she moved it somewhere else. And she also changed my mum's name from Elizabeth Lease to Elizabeth Lister. So if her mum had tried to find her, it's possible she wouldn't have been able to. They would go back to Devon, and she stayed in this house called Lochstoray. I went back there in 2017 to take some photos. And then I realized I had a photo of my mum in the same garden in front of probably the same tree, some 60-something years before. Now, Mum knew that she told me that she was a Russian-Polish Jew. When she met her parents, her stepmother had told her mother was half Jewish. So she always believed it was very important to her. Her Jewish identity was very important, but she didn't really know who she was. So that was kind of the background to my childhood. Mum would always tell me that her uncle had been killed by the Gestapo and her nephew had escaped to America after being badly beaten at 14 by the Germans. So I grew up knowing those things, but with no real context, no understanding of who she really was. I do remember when I was 10 years old, my own father had just died tragically, and I remember being uprooted and moved to a different school. And I was learning about the Holocaust, and I remember seeing the photograph of the little boy from the ghetto in Warsaw with his hands up and being drawn to this child's face. And that memory has never left me. I can remember where I was in the classroom. Little did I know the connection that I would have. This is my daughter, Faith. So I actually didn't do much to find out about my mum's background. I just accepted it. Until Faith she had a project to do at school on World War II. So I wrote to my mum, there she is with Faith as a little girl, and said, Mum, please could you write down every single thing you remember about your parents? I just knew it was important. She wrote it down. And Mum started this letter. This is just a portion. But sadly, a month after she wrote me this letter, she was diagnosed with cancer. She'd actually planned to come to Poland for the first time that year, but she was to get sick very quickly. And my mum, who'd been a fighter for the whole of her life, couldn't win that battle with cancer. And she died the following January in 2014. I went down to Devon, where Mum had been living, and went and had a coffee before I went to the funeral. And this was the front page of the newspaper. My mum was a town councillor. And in many ways, she followed after her father, even though she never knew him. He was always involved in lots of councils and things like that. And these are my siblings, minus one of my brothers, at my mother's funeral. But as I stood at the front of the church, in front of my mum's coffin, and I looked out at this wooden box, I realized that I didn't know the woman inside. In many ways, she'd shaped my life, for better, for worse, and I knew her very, very well. But as I looked at her coffin, I realized I didn't know who she was. She was a mystery. She kept secrets, but she had secrets kept from her. And I spoke to my brother Peter afterwards, and he said he'd felt exactly the same way. That we just didn't know. She was surrounded with this aura of mystery. So what I did was I went back home, all the way to Scotland. It's a long journey. And I thought about these things. But about 2 months later, I woke up one morning and I knew I had to find what had happened. I just woke up with the knowledge I had to find out who my grandparents were. And so the first thing I did actually was I prayed, because there's a verse in the book of Daniel that says there's a God in heaven that reveals mysteries. And I thought, this is a mystery that I need help uncovering. But then you got to roll your sleeves up and get on with it. So I came downstairs, gave my breakfast to some of my 9 children, and sent them off to school, sat down in a big red armchair, and I started writing out every tiny piece of information that I had, a page for my grandmother and a page for my grandfather. Now, looking at my grandmother's notes, I didn't have much between the two of them. I realized there was nothing that would be a starting point, because I didn't even know that her name was correct. So I looked at my grandfather's notes, and Mum had said that he'd been the Polish president in exile's personal representative, and also that he'd been the international secretary of the Polish Ex-Combatants Association. So I thought that was my starting point. So I Googled the Polish ex-combatants, the SPK, I think it is, and the lady on the end of the phone, after I told her my grandfather's name, said, "I know who your grandfather was." And she said, "I never met him." She'd been there since the 50s. But she said, "I can't believe I'm talking to the grandchild of someone so famous." And felt quite emotional. I thought, I had no idea. So she put me in touch with the SPK, and they actually unanimously agreed that I could show photographs from their archives for this presentation, so I just want to thank them. But she also told me to phone the Ministry of Defence, the Polish section in Britain, because my grandfather fought under British command in the Polish army. They would have his records. So that's what I did. I phoned them up, and within 5 minutes, the lady on the end of the phone found his records. And she said, "We have about 11 Stanisławlis, only one's an officer." And she said, "That is definitely your grandfather, because he had degrees. He had 2 degrees, one from Warsaw University and one from Lviv." So she was able to tell me immediately that he died in 1967, very sadly, right after my mum had met him, and she never knew that her father had died. And also, right before I was born too, actually. And also that he was buried in Gunnersbury Cemetery, a big Polish cemetery in London, and that he was born in 1902. But she asked me to send £30 in money, and my birth certificate, my mum's birth certificate, and she would send me his records with a loose translation. So I did that immediately. This all happened the first day I decided to search. And I put the thing in the post box and thought, okay, right. Couldn't wait for the results. But then I realized that my grandmother they had her records because she was also in the Polish army. They did. They confirmed it through my grandfather. So I sent another £30 and waited. But I wasn't idle. So what I did was I went on every Polish forum I could find. I went on Facebook. I joined groups, Tracing the Tribe, Kresy Siberia group. Any way that I could get information or make connections with people, I did. And I also wrote to Who Do You Think You Are through their magazine and asked if they could help me. But they said at the time they couldn't. So the day arrived that my grandmother's and grandfather's records came through my front door. And this is the first time I'd ever seen an image of my grandmother. There she is on the left, a tiny little image on an identity card. But I knew immediately that she was my mother's mother. I could just see it in her face. So all of a sudden, I had more information. I learned that she came from Stree. I didn't know where Stree was. She said she was Catholic. She really went and tried to prove the point by calling herself Helena Teresa Maria Anna. I thought she overdid it a little bit. I thought she was trying to convince somebody, but that went a bit too far. But she gave little information away about herself. My grandfather was the one that named her father as a Rothenberg. She did say her mother was called Francesca Probst, and that her father was Pavel, and that her maiden name was Solomoretska. So I searched Solomoretska and found out there was one other lady in the whole world that had called herself Solomoretska, and she lived in America. So I assumed that must be her sister, and her name was Irena, but more about Irena later. So I think you might recognize this face, some of you. But anyway, who do you think you are got back to me and said that their Jewish expert had got in touch and said, could he have my email address? Because he thought he could help me. So I said, absolutely, you can have my email address. I would love some help. And what better help could you get than Michael? So that same day, I think, Michael, you sent the records. He found the records of my great-grandparents in Poland. Francesca Probst, whose name was Fegidora, and Pinkas or Pavel Rothenberg. So Michael explained to me that they had Jewish names, but they also used they used Polish names. So he also found records for two girls, Rosa Rothenberg and Amalia Rothenberg. And I think initially we assumed that those were her sisters, Helena's sisters. But then I looked at Helena's date of birth on her MOD records, and I realized it matched the date of birth for Amalia. And I looked at Irena Solomoretska's date of birth, and I realized she was born on the 14th of August. But both girls deducted years from their age, and they continued to do so until they died. In fact, when my grandmother died, it's on her gravestone that she died that she was born in 1913. So they were quite some girls, I think. So here's the record Michael sent me with a photograph of my grandmother, the original record from the Jewish records in Stree. And there we are. Michael wrote me this letter, and he said, you do realize that because your grandmother was fully Jewish, that means you're Jewish also, and your mother and your children. And I've kept this email, printed it, because it meant so much to me. I had no idea at that point where this would take me, but it was a really powerful feeling, actually. And for a family that had no roots, we had no roots on my mum's side, and we'd had very disrupted roots on my dad's side after he died. My mum went on and she married 4 more times, and every time she married, she changed her children's names. And we didn't know whether we were up or down, but my brother, Peter, said, well, you can't get much more rooted than Abraham. And I agreed with him. So what did Helena's MOD records tell me? Well, they told me she was Helena Teresa Maria Anna, and not many people have that name. So I put it into Ancestry and found her marriage record. She divorced my grandfather and married. Mum believed she would be married to General Anders's bodyguard. In fact, he was his adjutant in London. So she married Jan Konopka. There he is there. He's 38. And Helena says she's 38 on the marriage certificate. Actually, she was 49. I know, some lady, right? So then through that, I traced her death certificate. And, I followed absolutely every lead I could find. She's named here as Baroness Helena Solomoretska, or Konopka. We would never have found Malia Rothenberg without all these steps and realized she'd become this lady. So I phoned the home, and I spoke to this nurse here, Magda, and she said she was the only nurse, this happened to me a lot, in the whole home who knew Helena. And she said, I could never forget your grandmother. She said, we've had lots of Polish people through this home, but none like Helena. She said she believed she owned the place. She had a bit of dementia. She was very wealthy in Poland, and she believed that the nurses were her servants, and she would tell them to turn off the lights. She was paying the bills. But she absolutely loved her, and she sent me this photo. But when I checked the map, I realized that I'd lived next door, 15 minutes from my grandmother in the 90s, for about 4 or 5 years. I was 15 minutes away, and I never knew. And she died in 2000. I mean, it was unbelievable. But what Magda told me was that her nephew used to write to her, and her neighbor. So I realized, well, there's 2 more people for me to find. So Michael suggested to me that I get in touch with the Royal Courts of Justice and see if I could find if she'd left a will. Well, she did. And she left all her money, or most of it, to her nephew, James W. Rosocki of Trenton, New Jersey. So there was my lead. And this came into my inbox. I was on holiday at midnight in a hotel, and I thought, okay, what do I do now? I've got this information. So I WhatsApped a friend of mine in America and said, please, could you look for James Rosocki? So I woke up to James's obituary in my inbox. And that was a sad moment, but it was also a defining moment, because I learned about James. He'd been in Majdanek concentration camp. Never knew he was Jewish. He'd been in the underground, actually, but he was a member of the CIA. He fought in Korea. This guy was something else. And he was confirmed that his mother was Irina Solomoretska. And he left 2 daughters. And here's James. You can see him with his grandparents, Pincus and Fegidora. So James had 2 daughters. I found them on Facebook. Who likes Facebook? I was so happy to find them. So I sent them a private message. But I'm an impatient person. You know, if anybody knows me, I want to get it done, if I can get it done quickly. So as soon as I could, they didn't respond to me immediately, within 5 minutes. So I did a paid search for Renata's phone number. And I called her up as soon as I could, and I said, Renata, was your dad James Rosocki? Yes. I said, did you have an aunt called Helena? Yes. I said, well, I'm her granddaughter. And she was blown away. That was another emotional call. And she said, just wait till my sister Sandy talks to you. She'd love to hear from you. And there they are, my second cousins. So when I spoke to Sandy, she said she cried when she found out she was Jewish. She said she'd just known it all her life, but she didn't think her dad ever knew. So then came the family pictures. This is my grandmother, with her family. They went to visit her in London. And these were lovely, lovely pictures to get. And then there's James and Irena in Poland, and James and Irena after the war. She also sent me her dad's memoirs, in which I learned that they hid a little Jewish boy that had escaped from the Warsaw ghetto. They lived in Warsaw. James found him starving on the street, took him in, and they hid him, and they looked after him. James, never knowing he himself was Jewish. And they were betrayed or arrested, taken to the Gestapo headquarters here in Warsaw. And James was beaten up so badly that he almost died, and I think he had surgery later in life as a result. He never saw his mother again till after the war, and he was sent to a camp. But like my grandfather, James must have learned from him, because he actually escaped. And at some point, he managed to join the army. Now, Irena, he believed, had been in Dachau throughout the war. I don't know if that's what she told him, but I also did a search with the ITS, the International Tracing Service, and the Red Cross. I searched every name I could think of, but they only gave me information on Irena, who apparently 4 days after her arrest in Warsaw was living in Vienna. She registered as living in Vienna, and she ended up living right across from the Gestapo headquarters, so we don't know what she was doing. Maybe she was hiding in plain sight. But when she applied to move to the United States, she got the certificate to certify that she was a member of the underground, the Home Army, from November 42 till 1945. So I would think in Vienna, she was working as part of the underground. And I also got this marriage photograph, which I absolutely love. I love the lady with the pillbox hat. I don't know who she is. But there's my grandmother being 38. And there's her sister Irena with the fur coat, and James stood right behind her. Now, I traced her neighbor, the neighbor that had been writing to her in the home. The sisters told me what his name was, so I traced him, and I went to London last year and met him. he wrote me this letter, and he said, when I wrote to him, he burst into tears, and he went on to tell me what Helena represented to him. So you can get so much information about your family from all these different connections. So finding Henrik, this is where Mark Halpern came in, because Michael couldn't find Henrik, the records hadn't been released, but we knew that from Helena's oral testimony that she had a brother who'd been executed, and that's my mum's writing up there. We didn't know his name, and Irena never told her son, so James never knew he had an uncle. But Mark found this record for Henrik Rothenberg, same parents, and he was born in 1912, murdered during the Holocaust, and I've not been able to find out any more about Henrik. In 2015, I liked a page called Seeking Kin because I liked the name. And the journalist who was in charge of this page, whose page it was, Hillel Cutler, emailed me and said, who are you looking for? So I said, I'm looking for my grandmother. So he wrote an article about me that went into the Times of Israel. And through that, I think, Michael got an email with a line of probs that had actually emigrated to the States in the late 1800s. But more than that, Hillel became my friend and encouraged me to connect with the Jewish community in Aberdeen. And so, over a period of time, the first service I went to was Yom Kippur, which they said, well, that's a service to go to, it's the first time you've been in the synagogue. But I've built up some good friendships with people there since then. Actually, I'm asked to photograph for them, and this image I took just recently at the rededication of their shul, and it's just been selected as a Scottish portrait finalist. So that's maybe good for the community, Jewish community in Scotland. That's Ephraim Borovitz. Borowski. Okay, sorry. So Machi, I don't think Machi's here. I also contacted a non-Jewish genealogist called Maciej Kolski because I was interested in the name Solomrecka. Now, Michael had built me a lovely tree for the probs, and that was wonderful to have all these Jewish names, in my family tree. But we couldn't find Pinchas Rothenberg, my great-grandfather. He owned or managed a sawmill. We knew that as well from James' records, but we couldn't find him anywhere. So we needed a breakthrough. We needed his parents' names. Now, one day, Maciej found this record for a marriage between a Rothenberg and a Gustav Kosden. Now, I knew my grandmother had been married before my grandfather, apparently when she was 18, but of course, again, she was lying about her age. So Gustav Kosden wasn't Jewish. So Maciej sent off for this marriage certificate. Yes, it was definitely Helena's. It was definitely her family. It mentions Paulus. Now the words became Latin. But when he received this record, he was told that there were more sensitive records that I needed to prove my identity before they would release them. So I sent every evidence that I could find that I was Helena's granddaughter, which you can imagine is challenging because she changed so many names. So sure enough, she converted to marry Gustav. And Maciej found this record in Lvov. But it didn't give us any further information, just that she'd converted. So we were hoping when we got her baptism certificate that would give us more information. So you can see at the top, Maciej says to me, here is your precious document, Jenny, because this document, even though it was a baptism certificate, unlocked the whole of the Rothenberg family because it named her grandparents as Zanarsis and I think Rosilia. Now, we knew that wasn't really their names, that they would have Jewish names beginning with Z and R, most likely. Well, the same day, in fact, hours later, I'd taken an autosomal DNA test with Ancestry. And so I'd uploaded it to FTDNA, and I went and checked this right after I got the baptism record. And I noticed I had a match with a Rothenberg. So Karen Franklin managed that match. I don't know where Karen's gone. And I wrote to her, and I said, I'm looking for Pinchas Rothenberg. And she said that he was in Alan's tree. And it turned out, actually, that Pinchas was Alan's grandfather's brother. So he's Alan's my mother's second cousin. So that was just amazing. And here he is, Alan Rothenberg from San Francisco, my mum, and then Alan's dad, Emil, who escaped through Austria, and my grandmother, and Leo and Pincus. And Zindel and Riva, there we are, the Z and the R. And so Alan then started sending me family photos. And Alan really reminds me a lot of my mum, and I'm going to be meeting him in London right after this conference. He sent me a letter from his Aunt Ada, who mentioned Pincus by name. And also more photographs, which enabled me to trace family members, close family members, first cousins that died in Auschwitz. So what a journey, I can tell you. And I went to Israel a couple of weeks later, and I said, Alan, are there any relatives in Israel? So he put me in touch with somebody in London who put me in touch with Rena Rothenberg, and as you can see from the family tree there, she's my grandmother's second cousin. So I found 3 generations of second cousins. So this was the first time I met anybody from my family. Now, my grandfather, Stanisław Lis. Mum, I have to say a little bit about him because he was so important. Mum knew a bit about him, spent some time with him. But after I got his MOD records, I was able to send off to Warsaw for other records. So I sent off to the military archives, to the University of Warsaw, also to the Sikorsky Institute in London, and they all came in Polish. So I thought, I've got to learn Polish. Well, that was a fail. But my Polish teacher put me in touch with a man that lived 15 minutes from my door in northeast Scotland, whose parents were deported to Siberia. And he had grown up in London, but he is a Polish military historian. So I met Janusz and spent hours in his office learning about Polish history and, you know, the different communities. And he traced lots of things about my grandfather. He translated a lot of the records. And as soon as he read my grandfather's records, he's like, this guy is really interesting. So there he is. There's my grandfather, second from the left with General Anders, third from the right. He knew him. He worked with him. But this, and this is the most moving to me, Janusz found my grandfather's eulogy that was given to the Polish government. And it says, for 4 years, from 1954 to 1959, he stood at the head of the movement for Polish unity. And it was at his particular insistence that the famous Silent March took place as a sign of protest of the Soviet occupation of Poland during the visit of Bulganin and Khrushchev in London. This was the greatest and most successful effort of President Lis, and of which he can be rightly proud. 20,000 people marched through the streets of London, and my grandfather handed a whole big folder of signatures to Downing Street. Malcolm Muggeridge was there, I think, with him. So that, of course, I was proud of that. And here he is. I searched for newspaper records representing Antony Klimovich, who stowed away on a ship from Gdansk, arriving in London, and my grandfather represented him as, and got him off on a habeas corpus. He was allowed to, he wasn't sent back to Poland. Now, when my sister found his grave in Gunnersbury Cemetery, it was surrounded by lots of big Polish graves to generals and everything. But my grandfather's grave was really inconspicuous, and it just said, he did not live to see again his beloved country. And I cried when my sister found that, and she cried when she read it, because he was obviously a humble man who loved his country. And what a tribute. So here we go. There's my grandmother, top right, her sister, top left. Her sister has 6 descendants, my grandmother has the rest. So half of them are mine, I might add. So anyway, from this hidden baby, second from right, my mum, came all this life. I also was sent lots of other things, and I'm just putting this in at the end here. Photographs. This photograph came from Poland, from Jan Konopka's niece. And this is my grandmother next to a friend in London called Teresa Somkovich. So I decided, okay, I'm going to trace Teresa Somkovich and this little girl. So 2 months ago, I met them. She lives in Wales. Teresa is 92. She was deported to Kazakhstan from Lvov. Her father was killed at Katyn. And Kika, her daughter, I spent a long time with her, stayed in her home. I invited myself. And they told me a lot about my grandmother, but about Poland. And I also met another cousin of Rena Rothenberg's, Elisa, is Rena's cousin through her mother, and I'm Rena's cousin through her father. And Adam and Elisa are both survivors. These were the first survivors I ever met. And actually, Adam is Robin McGidd's cousin. And now, this verse has stayed with me throughout all my search. Those from among you will rebuild the ancient ruins. You will raise up the age-old foundations of generations, and you will be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of the streets in which to dwell. And for me, you know, this has been a breach in my family of generations. We had no knowledge. We didn't know who we were, where we came from. It was stolen. And this was my motivation. And, you know, now with these 3 generations of second cousins that are still living, that breach has been repaired. So thank you very much for listening to my presentation. And thank you. Any questions? If you do have any questions, we'll give you a microphone before you ask it. So does anybody have any questions? Nobody? You do? Okay, over here.
What do your children think of your newfound identity, or then their found identity?
Well, I think that they, you know, it's taken a while to get used to the fact that, you know, we've discovered all of this. And I'm their mom, I'm not cool. But, you know, 3 of my children have been to Israel with me, and they've sent me supportive messages about me coming today. And gradually, you know, this has been reclaimed for them. So I feel that as they get older, and because when I was younger, I wasn't really that interested. And I'm not saying they're not interested, they are, but I think I began to connect later in life. And I absolutely fully expect my children to do the same thing. Anybody else? Okay. Thank you very much.